Looking for soul opens a new unexplored door. Tune in and soar with us, let's flow. Discover the unknown, see where we go.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're not tracking a sudden scandal or a single piece of headline-grabbing legislation.
No.
We're looking at something far more subtle and, frankly, much harder to see in real time.
Absolutely. It's how dozens of small, seemingly unrelated government decisions scattered across different departments over nearly a decade.
How they all stack up.
Exactly, how they stack up to create the singular, often invisible pattern of systemic change.
And the source materials we're looking at today give this a name, don't they?
They do. They call it the architecture of democratic compression.
Right.
And our mission for this deep dive is to really analyze a comprehensive timeline. It runs from 2016 right up to the present day in the UK.
And it focuses on three key policy areas.
That's right. Digital identity, policing powers, and online safety regulation. And the key thing is, we aren't here to judge any single policy in isolation.
No, it's about the big picture.
It's about understanding the cumulative effect these decisions have on, the whole architecture of governance.
And we should say, we know from the note you sent us that tracing this kind of gradual squeeze can, well, it can raise legitimate concern.
Of course.
It can leave you feeling unsure of what, if anything, you can do.
Mm-hmm.
So, built into our deep dive today is an analysis of a very specific actionable tool.
Kind of accountability mechanism.
Yes, a detailed letter template addressed directly to your member of parliament. If this material resonates with your concerns about consent and accountability,
then rest assured, that MP letter template will be in the description box of this deep dive for you to use.
Okay, let's unpack this timeline, starting with the very foundations.
That takes us back to 2016 to 2019, so before any of the major constitutional turbulence.
Right.
And this era, it was all about building out the digital scaffolding of governance. It's when we saw the expansion of gov.uk Verify.
That early attempt at a centralized digital ID system.
Exactly, and the introduction of these cross-departmental identity concepts.
And the public-facing narrative was always laser-focused on efficiency. Digitization was framed purely as a way to streamline bureaucracy, making government run faster and cheaper.
Especially with automated decision-making for things like benefits and taxation. I mean, who could argue with efficiency?
Well, that's the key, isn't it? The sources show that because the public debate was all about convenience, the civil implications were barely visible.
Right, but even back then, civil society groups were sounding alarms, specifically about two concepts. The first one was function creep.
Okay, let's explain function creep, because that's a dense bit of jargon.
Think of it this way. You get a smart meter for your energy. It collects data for one specific purpose billing.
Okay.
Function creep is that quiet process where the government decides years later that the infrastructure built for your bills could also be used to track energy patterns for, say, a police investigation.
So data collected for one thing
silently starts being used for others.
Yeah.
Totally outside the original scope or your consent.
So the foundation was built on this idea that efficiency justifies these big identity systems, even while warnings about transparency were already being issued.
Precisely. And the lack of any immediate visible harm meant those warnings were, largely ignored.
And then came 2020 and 2021.
Yes. This is where the governance model fundamentally shifted because of the pandemic. The COVID emergency legislation, it allowed the suspension of normal procurement safeguards.
And it drastically reduced parliamentary scrutiny.
It did.
I remember that time just feeling chaotic. But the sources point out that the chaos had a real institutional consequence that lasted much longer than the virus.
It really did. What's fascinating here is that emergency governance normalized speed over scrutiny.
Right.
The immediate crisis justified cutting corners, rushing contracts, bypassing debate, and that precedent, it just extended far beyond the immediate need.
Classic example the sources always cite is the huge controversy around PPE procurement.
Absolutely.
The sheer scale of the waste, the conflicts of interest that were exposed, and the fact that at the end of the day, very few people faced any real accountability.
Well, that taught politicians that speed rarely comes with severe political consequences.
And that's the crucial takeaway, isn't it?
It is. The failure of those post facto accountability mechanisms, it reinforced that speed over scrutiny model. It essentially gave the executive permission to move faster, forever.
And that rapid legislative appetite, It translated into permanent, lasting power shifts starting in 2021.
Now we're moving into segment 2, legislative power shifts. And specifically, we saw this massive expansion of police powers through the Policing, Crime, Sentencing, and Courts Act.
This introduced broader controls over protest disruption and fritti.
Notoriously, these new public order thresholds, including the concept of serious annoyance.
That phrase, serious annoyance, just seems almost absurdly vague for a legal threshold. How did the sources analyze the practical effect of that?
They noted that public confusion just grew immensely. I mean, if the legal framework allows police to shut down a protest, not because it's violent, but because it's annoying.
It creates a chilling effect.
Oh, of course. The source material points to a growing imbalance, a heavy focus on regulating expression and nonviolent protest, while outcomes for serious violent crime were stagnant or even worsening.
So the fundamental shift is that the state granted itself broader discretion without equivalent public reassurance mechanisms.
That's the perfect summary. The power to enforce expanded, but the mechanisms for the public to question or demand transparency about how that power was being used didn't keep pace.
And at the same time, the digital identity structure was getting deeper.
Absolutely. Between 2022 and 2023, we saw the gradual integration of one login for government across services you need for daily life, HMRC, the DVLA, benefits, pensions.
You know, I find the analysis connecting the consolidation of something like the DVLA database with a protest law from years later, that's probably the most unsettling part of this timeline. It's so hard to see them as related.
But they braid together structurally. When you increase the state's knowledge of its citizens through these unified digital IDs, and you simultaneously increase the state's discretion to act against those citizens through expanded police powers, you are fundamentally shifting that power dynamic.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the argument from proponents is that one login is objectively better for security. It makes everything easier for you, the citizen.
And that's the core counter-argument the sources tackle. The convenience is real.
But the price of that convenience, in this case, is consent.
Exactly. The key characteristic of this phase is that consent was implied through service use rather than explicitly sought.
So every time you claim universal credit or renew your license through this system, you're implicitly agreeing to the data architecture underneath it all.
That's it.
But where's the transparency? Is there a central map of where all this data can go?
That is the critical missing piece. There was and there remains very limited public visibility on the cross-system data protection impact assessments, or DPIAs.
Okay, hold on. Let's just define DPIA for a second.
A data protection impact assessment is the mechanism that's meant to map out exactly where the risks are. You know, where is the sensitive data, who can access it, and what are the potential harms if it's misused.
And the public rarely sees these.
Or they're presented department by department. The sources are clear. There was no single consolidated DPIA covering the massive linkage across all state systems.
Which means the scope, permanence, and that function creep we talked about.
What happened without explicit democratic consent?
Let's move on to probably the most controversial piece of legislation in this period, the Online Safety Act.
Introduced across 2023 and 2024. Now, this act was billed as necessary protection, especially for children. It imposed new duties on platforms covering sensitive areas like suicide, self-harm, eating disorders, and addiction.
The intent was aimed at public good. No one disputes that.
No, but the structural mechanism caused a major problem. The compliance model relies heavily on automated moderation and mandatory age assurance,
which created these powerful structural incentives for platforms to just be incredibly risk-averse.
Cripplingly so. They feared massive fines if they got moderation wrong.
And that risk aversion led directly to measurable, unintended consequences, what the sources call indirect harm.
Precisely. The sources detail how the compliance costs and liability risks forced fundamental shifts. We saw the age gating, or sometimes the outright withdrawal of UK access to legitimate mental health peer support spaces.
And we're not talking about big commercial platforms here.
No, we're talking about smaller, often nonprofit or volunteer-run providers.
So give us a concrete example. How did the law compel harm without explicitly banning these sites?
Okay, let's imagine a UK-based nonprofit forum for adults discussing recovery from self-harm, a vital support mechanism.
Right.
The Online Safety Act mandates that they have to verify the age of every single user, use new moderation tools, and meet new standards. The cost for the mandated age-gating software alone could be tens of thousands of pounds a year.
A cost a volunteer organization just can't absorb.
No way. So they have two choices. Risk a huge fine they can't pay, or just shut down UK access.
I'll move the whole thing overseas.
Exactly. And the expert analysis is crystal clear on this. The harm was indirect harm caused through structural incentives, not explicit prohibition. The government never said, close these mental health forums.
But they compelled structural changes that achieved the exact same result.
Yes, reducing access to crucial informal support for vulnerable adults.
That's a really powerful example of how governance by structural incentive can just bypass parliamentary oversight.
It is. The regulator uses secondary legislation to dictate the rules, and then private platforms enforce the de facto speech boundaries.
Shifting to the present and near future, so 2024 onward, the timeline reveals these escalating signals of democratic dilution.
And this isn't through direct voting suppression, but through governance restructuring.
And it takes two forms, according to the sources.
It does. First, you have smaller examples, like the cancellation or postponement of local elections in some areas. But second, and structurally much bigger, are the new devolution frameworks.
Which consolidate power.
Yes, they consolidate strategic and fiscal power at a regional executive level, so away from local council control.
So you still get to vote, but your vote has less leverage. If local councils can't set meaningful spending priorities because their funds are all tied up regionally or centrally.
Your local vote starts to feel purely symbolic.
That's the key takeaway. Voting continues, but leverage decreases.
Exactly. The material impact of your vote is weakened by centralizing the decisions that look, on the surface, to be local.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture of data and surveillance, we see this escalation from 2024 into 2025.
There are escalating proposals to link biometric data, so passport data, facial recognition, policing, and border systems.
And this is where that earlier lack of transparency around DPIAs really comes home to roost.
It really does. Public concern is rising exponentially over the permanence of this biometric data and the total lack of an opt-out mechanism.
And these capabilities are almost always expanded beyond their original purpose.
It's that classic function creep in action, but now it involves your face and your fingerprints.
And the fundamental finding that connects all these surveillance capabilities is that safeguards lag behind capability.
Always. The technology can be deployed tomorrow, but the binding legal and democratic protections to prevent misuse, they take years to debate.
So when you summarize the cumulative effects, say, from 2025 onward, the sources paint a really clear picture.
They do. A citizenry reporting reduced trust, genuine confusion over their rights, and critically, a measurable increase in self-censorship.
A fear of speaking openly.
Yes. And the governance pattern is this increasing reliance on secondary legislation rules made by ministers or regulators and compulsory platform compliance, which keeps the real action off the floor of Parliament.
And this convergence of centralized identity, expanded state discretion, governance by platform incentive, and diluted local leverage.
That is precisely what the sources define as persistent democratic compression.
It's not a single authoritarian event.
No, it's a gradual systemic squeeze. It's the architectural shift.
Right. Now, if tracing this pattern has raised concerns for you about consent, about proportionality and accountability, we return to that practical response we mentioned at the start.
The MP letter template.
Yes, this detailed letter addressed to your MP. It's a nonpartisan, non-allegation document designed to demand answers on the cumulative pattern we've just been talking about.
And the goal of the letter isn't to complain about one single policy, it's to challenge the overall architecture. Should we break down the 4 core demands in the template?
Let's do it. First, it targets that indirect harm of the Online Safety Act.
It demands to know what formal assessment has been made of the Act's impact on adult mental health peer support.
So it forces the government to address that measurable unintended consequence.
Yes. Second, it focuses directly on democratic dilution.
The question there is, what specific safeguards exist to prevent the continued dilution of local influence through governance restructuring?
It pushes back on that decrease in voter leverage.
Third, it goes to the bedrock of digital identity.
And the letter requests the specific location of the consolidated DPIA covering digital identity linkage across all state systems.
The issue there isn't whether the tech works. It's demanding transparency on the full scope, the permanence, and the function creep.
All of which happened without explicit democratic consent. And finally, on policing and proportionality.
Which gets at that eroded public trust.
The letter asks, how is proportionality in policing priorities? So, that intense focus on regulating expression versus the outcomes for serious crime, how is that being evaluated and communicated to the public?
It demands justification for that perceived imbalance. And crucially, the letter doesn't just ask for policy answers.
No, it requests confirmation of which parliamentary mechanisms, select committees, inquiries, independent reviews are being used to address these specific cumulative issues.
So it demands systemic oversight, not just single issue, departmental fixes.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean for you? The sources are clear in their neutral conclusion. Individually, each measure, a new digital system, a tweak to police powers, it might be defensible on its own terms.
Collectively, they raise legitimate questions about consent, proportionality, accountability, and crucially, reversibility.
And these are not marginal concerns. They are fundamentally democratic questions about the kind of society being built beneath the noise of daily headlines.
We've shown that governance increasingly operates through secondary legislation and platform compliance, moving decision-making away from the open floor of Parliament.
One closer to regulatory and corporate discretion. So if these cumulative issues, the shrinking leverage of citizens, the rising surveillance capabilities, the unintended harms of structural incentives, if they resonate with you,
The full, detailed MP letter template we analyzed is available for your use right now.
in the description box of this deep dive.
And this all raises an important question for you to consider long after you close this deep dive. Given that policy is increasingly implemented through these structural incentives and compulsory platform compliance, what effective mechanisms are left for citizens to influence policy before implementation? And how can you practically ensure the reversibility of policy if unintended harms, like the closure of those peer support forums, actually happen?
That tension between speed and democratic oversight is the core architectural challenge of modern governance.